Browns took a risk to get into this mess. It'll take some risks to get out of it. I'll tell you why. There's no easy out from the DeShaun Watson situation next on the Locked On Browns podcast.
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Dog Pound? I'm Spencer German, your host of the Locked On Browns podcast, proudly covering your Cleveland Browns each and every single day in the land and on the road. The Browns took a risk to get into the mess that they find themselves in. They'll have to take some risks to get out of it. I'll talk about that coming up. Everybody of influence is apparently coming back in 2025, according to Jimmy Haslam. Or are they? Is Joel Bitonio about to play his final home game against the Dolphins this weekend? I'll tell you why I don't think so. All that and more coming up on today's show. As always, I want to thank you for being an everydayer and making the Locked On Browns podcast your first listen every day. Of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play just $5. Without further ado, let's get into it. Guys, trading for DeShaun Watson was a risk for the organization. It didn't pay off. It's going to take some risk to get out of this situation now that they find themselves ready to, in my opinion, navigate life without DeShaun Watson or start thinking about life without DeShaun Watson. It's not going to be easy. And I want to be clear here because I have been adamant from the day this trade was made that I didn't blame the organization for trying to upgrade the quarterback position. Who could? An organization in the Browns that since they came back in 1999 have been desperate to find a franchise quarterback. They've been searching high and low, turning over all the stones you possibly could. They've been trying to draft them. They've been trying to sign them. They have just never been able to get this position right specifically. And so they took a big swing. They swung for the fences. And I understand people are going to make the case that they should have never moved on from Baker Mayfield. The truth of the matter is there was more stuff behind the scenes in terms of his relationship with some of his teammates, how he was viewed in the locker room, how the organization viewed him as a leader of the organization. It was an untenable situation. So whether or not you think they should have kept Baker at that time, and Baker's even talked about this, like he needed to mature. He's matured since then, and he's a better player because of it. But at that time, I don't know that it was going to work here in Cleveland for him anymore. They knew that. He knew that. And because he demanded the trade and sort of forced the Browns' hand, this is the situation they were dealt. Because if you remember, like they were off the table for DeShaun, and then they came back to the table with the $23 million offer, and suddenly they were back in the mix, and he signed. So, again, I don't blame them for trying to upgrade the quarterback position. We all knew at that time Baker had some limitations. We weren't sure if we were still sort of asking ourselves, like, is he that guy? There was moments, but there was ups and downs throughout his career. The problem is they picked the wrong guy to invest in. They picked the wrong guy to pursue. And I think there is a trend now. All these teams that try to sort of cut the line on franchise quarterbacks, the Broncos, they did it with Russell Wilson, the Jets with Aaron Rodgers, and the Browns, obviously, with DeShaun. All those situations have blown up in their faces since they tried to do it. So I think you're seeing the results of, like, you can't try to skip steps here to finding a franchise quarterback and building behind that franchise quarterback. It comes down to drafting correctly and finding that guy in the draft. And so I do think that is on the table for the Browns this offseason. I also think there's other options on the table this offseason. I threw out and asked you on social media to send some topics, some things that you might want to talk about on some of the shows this week during the holiday week here. And one of the big things that I kept getting in my mentions was Kirk Cousins memes and GIFs and people chiming in and saying, should the Browns go after Kirk Cousins and kind of asking that question. I think Kirk Cousins is a legitimate, realistic option for this Browns team because of how they're going to be able to get him. It's going to be like Russell Wilson in Pittsburgh. He's going to get cut. The Falcons are going to have to eat whatever of his salary cap that they're going to have to eat. And that's going to pave the way for a team like Cleveland to swoop in and pay him basically like $1 million to play on their roster next year. So I think that is a viable option for them and something that they will pursue. on top of probably drafting a quarterback at some point. I don't know if that's going to be in the first round. It could be, especially if they keep going up the board. They're now the 5 pick after this past weekend's loss and some of the other results that played out. So there is a chance that they get even higher, and they are in position to draft one of these top quarterbacks that they maybe fall in love with. But I do think at some point they're taking a quarterback, and they will try to sell that quarterback to the fan base as some great future, franchise guy. But all these things come with risks, and that's kind of the larger point here. The Browns took a big swing and took some risk in acquiring DeShaun Watson, given what he was coming to Cleveland with. The off-the-field stuff that clearly became too much for him to carry. It became too heavy of a load. He went from being an adored player in this league, one of the Boy Scouts of the league, the player that people admired and spoke so highly of, to basically becoming the villain, where every place he played, everywhere he went, even in his home stadium, there was fans who just weren't happy with him and were ready to boo him, were ready to pounce the second things went wrong. And we saw that play out in the ugliest form earlier this season when he gets hurt and some of the fans cheered for it. So the Browns didn't account for that. And that was probably the risk assessment that they were missing in their evaluation of bringing DeShaun here. They probably thought he'd be able to handle it and be okay. And the fact of the matter was he wasn't. And they also, I don't think, accounted for him being away from the game for several years. I from my understanding, what I know about the situation, I don't think they believed that he was going to get suspended 11 games. I think they really thought it was going to be like 4 or so, and then he'd be back that first season, and we might be talking about a different story or situation. But he basically missed like back-to-back years without playing football because of that. And I don't know that they were able to sort of weigh what that meant to his mental capacity, how he saw the game, and he just doesn't look like he sees things the same way he used to. And listen, better than anybody, you watch these games, especially early in the season when he was playing and saw how terrible the offense was with him at the helm. He's slow to process. He's not the same quarterback anymore. And so the Browns didn't account for that when they're in their assessment of what he was going to come here with, given how things had kind of gone in the years leading up to the trade. And so, yeah, you took a risk and you missed. And I'm not trying to make light of it. It is a sticky situation when you have a quarterback making a fully guaranteed contract. It was $230 million to start. If they were to cut ties with him, it's $172 million in dead cap money that they have to take on immediately. So that all is why, that's the biggest reason why I don't see a way that he's not on the roster next year. He's going to be part of this team in some capacity, whether it's competing for the job, whether it's maybe they pitch some scenario where they pay him just not to be around. I don't think they're going to do that, though. I think they're going to kind of open this up as like, we'll have it be an open competition. That's the one thing I can say I think is going to be different. I don't think they're going to make it just it's DeShaun's job and everybody else is competing for the backup spot. Like, no, I think it's going to be an open competition. And that's where I think what I'm trying to get at here, like the taking of risk comes into play. They're going to have to take some flyers on maybe an aging Kirk Cousins who started the year pretty well and now is just kind of falling off a cliff, but has some history with Kevin Stefanski. They might have to take a swing on a Sam Darnold who's having this renaissance season for the Minnesota Vikings and showing that he can maybe do something in this league. Like maybe Kevin Stefanski can tap into that a little bit and get him playing at a high level the same way he is for the Vikings right now. They're going to have to take some chances on veteran quarterbacks that are out there and see if they become a viable option for them. They're going to have to take a chance and probably draft a rookie in a class that is being called not a very talented class, like a class that is lacking in terms of like the frontline prospects that talent evaluators are seeing right now. So those are the risks you're going to have to sort of take to get out of this thing, or at least navigate this thing for the next couple of years until the DeShaun Watson contract becomes less of a dark cloud, less of an albatross over the organization. So it's the situation that they're dealt, because as I talked about with the Myles Garrett comments after the game, he had the comments on Friday, but I talked about it after the game on Sunday. Like, Myles is within his right to hold the organization's feet to the fire and sort of say, like, I want proof that you're still trying to win right now. I think that's totally fair for him to do. There's not a lot of players who can do that in this organization. Myles is probably the one. But I honestly think, like, the entire organization was already probably thinking that way anyway. Nobody can afford to go out and lose next year and just tank this thing, because jobs are on the line. Like Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski, if they're really coming back, they can't tank a season because they'll be fired the year after that if they do that. Their seats get hotter if they have another losing season. So I do think they're going to try to thread the needle, and doing that while trying to sort of navigate the DeShaun Watson situation, the DeShaun Watson business that they got into, the bad business decision that they got into, is going to take some risk. There's no perfect answer. I know everybody wants to just point and say, I like this guy, I like that guy. You probably have your opinion on who you think the best quarterback option is, and then hate some of the others. There's no perfect answer. But if they're going to try to steady the ship and stay competitive and keep this window open for a little bit longer, as long as they can, yeah, it's going to take some risk. You're going to take flyers on guys, and you're just going to have to hope that it works. And by the way, for me, I think the Kirk Cousins deal is brilliant if it happens that way. Because for $1 million or whatever the vet minimum is going to be, why not take a chance with a guy that has some history with Kevin Stefanski? We talk about everybody coming back. Jimmy Haslam keeps telling everybody that everybody he can that the people with significance in this organization are safe this offseason. But how far down does that extend? I have some questions about some other notable names coming up here on the Locked On Browns podcast. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. With just 2 weeks to go in the NFL season, things are heating up with the playoffs just around the corner, and you can get in on the action at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can finish the season strong with $250 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. I'm a big anytime touchdown parlay builder. I try to do it every so often, every couple weeks, but with the playoffs coming, sometimes I go a little bit more bold and I dabble in the first touchdown bets to see if I can nail those for some of the playoff teams. There are so many ways for you to win, from betting an individual player stats, trying to nail an over or under, nailing each team's score, and much, much more. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your chance at $250 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbooks partner of the NFL. So Jimmy Haslam is telling everybody he can. I know Aditi Kinkhabwala, she was on the broadcast this week on Sidelines, and she made a comment on the broadcast about how she had talked to Jimmy Haslam before the game and how he reiterated Kevin Stefanski, Andrew Berry, both safe, as he's not going to overreact to a bad season and just fire everybody and make it this whole fire sale and blow it all up like he tended to do in the past. He has learned from his mistakes in that way, and he trusts those two to keep this organization going in the right direction and keep the ship steadied. So, and listen, at this point, I believe him. Like, I guess if something really crazy happened and we find out there's some feud between Myles Garrett and Kevin Stefanski or something, maybe that would change and you lose faith in them. But I don't see that happening. I think if Jimmy Haslam is saying these things, he believes that these are the right people to lead his organization, at least going into 2025, and that they will be back. Now, what's interesting is we keep talking about like running it back with a lot of the same guys from a coaching standpoint, from a front office standpoint. I don't know how far down that trickles, though, as you start to talk about like changes that do need to be made. I don't know that just because Kevin Stefanski is safe, it means that most of his coaching staff is safe. Even though they made some changes last offseason, I think they're in line for even more changes to this coaching staff, maybe even more so than the personnel staff or the front office staff. They got some issues. And the biggest spotlight I'm going to put here on a coach, I would say, is Ken Dorsey as the offensive coordinator. I understand that they just changed offensive coordinators this past offseason, moving on from Alex Van Pelt and hiring Ken Dorsey. I think there's a really good chance that Ken Dorsey suffers the same fate this offseason and the Browns go in a different direction there. A couple reasons why. I think, first of all, what purpose does Ken Dorsey serve to this organization without DeShaun Watson being the starter, which is what I was talking about in the first segment? I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case. And if they do trot him out there, I mean, it is going to be riots from the fans. Like, nobody believes that he should be the starting quarterback again next year, except maybe the organization, because they're trying to be proven right about their trade. But I think they're wise enough to understand that's probably not going to happen. They have to start thinking about other options. It is to stay competitive, put the best team out there. We don't even know if DeShaun Watson is going to be ready week 1. So with all those things in mind, like Ken Dorsey was brought here to be the watchful eye and the steadying presence that could call an offense and draw up an offense for Deshaun Watson's skill set, the running style, the RPO stuff, the stuff that he does well, while also being able to throw the ball a little bit. And, we referenced Josh Allen and Cam Newton, like these other great running quarterbacks out there that he had worked with in the past. If Deshaun Watson isn't the starter, if the plan here is to kind of go in a different direction while he might still be on the team, again, I just asked the question, what purpose does Ken Dorsey serve here? And also on the heels of Myles Garrett's comments last week, he basically, one of the most interesting things he said was he was giving input on what he thinks the offense needs to be. Like he said he wants to win now. He said he doesn't want to be part of a rebuild, but he also said, if we're going to go back to being sort of this ball control style offense where we run the ball, like he was telling you like what worked previously for this organization during the Baker days and how he kind of wants to see that. Like that's not the style of offense they were running under Ken Dorsey with Deshaun Watson at quarterback. And he clarified after the game on Sunday that he wasn't trying to take a shot at Deshaun Watson with those comments, but it certainly felt like it was an indictment of like how they've drawn this thing up in recent years with Deshaun as the focal point and trying to like throw the ball all over the field, and that just isn't working for them. And so if they're trying to go back to being a run first team, if they're trying to go back to having the run be more of a factor in a proponent of this offense, again, I asked the question, what purpose does Ken Dorsey serve? Because they aren't going to be a run first or a run heavy team with Dorsey. It was part of his problems with Buffalo that got him fired. And I think we've seen similar trends here where he goes away from the run game, and I understand some of it just hasn't worked as well this year because the offensive line has struggled. But I also think that's because the offensive line has been prepared and taught this season to prepare for this pass-heavy offense, and that's been the case for a lot of these games. Joel Bitonio has talked about that, who we will talk about here coming up. But like when you do so much of one thing, it's hard to then go back to the other mid-season and try to sort of pivot to be more of a run-heavy team and blocking those concepts up. So I find that interesting. I think Ken Dorsey is very much in jeopardy. And plus, if you're bringing in a different quarterback, who's to say Kevin Stefanski doesn't just take back the play call? And especially if it's a quarterback rather that Kevin thinks he can thrive with, like Kirk Cousins, as I said earlier in the show. It kind of makes sense for him to retain those play calling duties and take those back. We'll see. But I have big questions about Ken Dorsey's future here. Another coordinator who I think could be in trouble is Bubba Ventrone, which stinks because I really like Bubba Ventrone. The conversations we have with him every Thursday, I feel like are pretty enlightening sometimes. He seems like a good dude. He's been pretty informative on things, like teaching us about the new kickoff rule and all this different stuff. Like, great dude, and he's by all respects like considered one of the better offense or special teams coordinators in the NFL. So I don't necessarily want to see him go in that regard, but the proof is in the pudding, and his units haven't been good enough this year in particular. They've been bad, and so it's been a problem that I think might be too large to ignore at this point, and they might have to go in a different direction. So we'll see if they do decide to do that, but I think he's in a little bit of trouble. And then on an even lower level or a lower sort of position or a thought process here in terms of like a position coach, I'm very curious about Andy Dickerson's job security as well. We know the impact that losing Bill Callahan had on this team this year, where the offensive line just hasn't been the same. I think that certainly is part of that. But also, Andy Dickerson at practice looking a lot more hands off than he did early in the season. And given how much that unit regressed, I just think that they have to think about finding a different route to go there, potentially a different option there. And so those are some of the names that kind of come to mind for me. Like, I get it. I get why Kevin Stefanski's safe. I get, for the sake of continuity, why, Jimmy Haslam isn't going to just like blow it all up with those two, and he wants to sort of keep those two together and see if they can navigate this thing. And Andrew Berry he must have had some sort of plan for how to, finagle the DeShaun Watson contract enough to still have some flexibility to do things and stay competitive and keep this window of contention that they believe they were going to be in open. So he wants to let them see that through. Fine. but I don't necessarily think it's like a blanket just because Kevin Stefanski and Andrew Berry are safe. Everybody is safe, and those are the names that are already kind of at the forefront of my mind. Ken Dorsey, Bubba Ventrone, Andy Dickerson, for guys who could be on the hot seat and could be when the season finishes here in the next couple weeks. Your first names that pop up is like they've parted ways with, they have moved on from so-and-so. So just keep those things in mind, because I do think that's coming. And, running it back with Stefanski and Berry doesn't mean running it back with everybody who was part of this disastrous season that we've seen unfold this year. Speaking of the offensive line and the struggles this year, a Browns legend could be hanging them up at the end of the season. I think, though, he's got a little bit more in the tank. I'll explain coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. Well, it's official. I made it to the finals, the championship, in one of my season-long fantasy leagues. Lost in the semifinals in another. I'm bummed I didn't make it in both, and it stings a little bit more when you know how much time and energy and money that I put into these leagues, and it all kind of goes to waste. But fortunately, I can reverse, and so can you, your fantasy football fortunes with PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the easiest, most exciting way to play daily fantasy and have a shot to win big every single day or week of the season, whether it's football, basketball, or any of your favorite sports. PrizePicks can make your holidays bigger and brighter. You can now win up to 1,000 times your money on PrizePicks. Plus, this holiday season, they're giving away $30+ million in rewards during Picksmas and offering 2 free picks in December. And when your picks hit, PrizePicks makes it easy for you to cash out. You can get your money in as fast as 15 minutes. Download the PrizePicks app today and use the code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after your first $5 lineup. That's $50 instantly when you play just $5. PrizePicks, run your game. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions that you might have forgot about or that you were paying for twice? That definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions that I didn't even realize I was still paying, and Rocket Money made it easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so that you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals that you want to hit in a year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year. When using all the app's premium features. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach for your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/lockedon. All right. The end might be near for one Joel Bitonio. We know that he's getting up there in age, which is kind of funny to say because he's 33 years old and I'm 33 years old. And I'm like, I don't feel like 33 is all that old, but in football, in the football world, once you get to 30, you might as well be, ancient history. So I get why we're starting to have the conversation with him. I also think it plays into last year. Joel sort of hinted at the end of the season about the idea that he had battled so many injuries last year and he was kind of banged up and still sort of going through some things and knew he had to recover during the offseason, that I think he kind of left that door open a little bit. And so, of course, it was, he was asked those questions during the offseason. He was asked those questions at the start of the season if he knows his time is, he knows his time in the NFL is fleeting. He's a veteran in this league. He's been doing it for 11 years. This is 11th season. So he mentions it that he understands where he's at timeline wise in his career. But we asked him after the game about that very thing. Like, are you at all thinking about these being the last 2 games that you play in the NFL, against the Dolphins at home and then on the road against the Ravens? And he said he wasn't ready to talk about it. I even asked, like, as a follow-up, whether or not he thought, like, with Myles Garrett's comments this past week about rebuild versus wanting to stay competitive, if that was something that would weigh into his decision. And he got a little bit more reflective at that question where it was like, yeah, I played over 160 games in this league, and I understand I can't do it forever. It's been a long time, but he made it sound like he still wasn't really ready or thinking about that, and that's totally fair. I think it's fair that we ask the questions. I also think it's fair that he's not ready to give an answer at this point because he's still in the middle of the season. He's still playing games, and he wants to finish the season on a high note, the best that he can. So, I respect that. I respect the fact that he wants to do that, and we'll see how things wrap up here. But it is possible that you will be watching Joel Bitonio suit up in a Cleveland Browns uniform at Huntington Bank Field for the last time in his career, which is kind of crazy to think about because he's been phenomenal, like on the heels of Joe Thomas and what he's meant to this organization, becoming a Hall of Famer. You kind of followed up with Joel Bitonio being of that same ilk. He might be still sort of like a fringe Hall of Famer. He might need a little bit more accolades wise to kind of get there, but I think he's close. But regardless, like to have sort of two guys back to back that anchor that offensive line and got to play together a little bit. They had a little bit of time overlapping. It's kind of a unique thing and a cool thing. And we know fans love Joel. You love Joel. I love Joel from just being able to cover him. He's always very candid. He's great. But it's an interesting situation and one that he obviously has to think about this offseason. Now, I'm going to just put this out there now. I don't think he's going to retire. I think there's a couple reasons why, like I said, and this could change because there's 2 games to go, and he always could come up with some injury that then changes his mind because the recovery might just be too much or whatever. I'm not hoping that happens. Let's knock on some wood here. I don't want to see that happen. I don't think you want to see that happen. Nobody wants to see that happen. So, yes, that could change things. But I think right now, like, yeah, he's had some bumps and bruises this year. It's more sort of like the ordinary stuff that he always experiences throughout his any season or throughout his career. He had a back issue, 2 weeks back that sort of flared up, and he said he's dealt with that before. But he right now, my read on it is that he's feeling healthier than he did a year ago. So I don't think that's going to, and he mentioned that being like the biggest thing, like how his body feels this offseason will be the biggest indicator of whether or not he thinks he can come back or not. I also think too, the state of this season, the way that things have gone, where there was Super Bowl talk, playoff talk. They had just pulled that off last year. They had just gotten to the playoffs a year ago, and it was supposed to be about like passing that baton and, passing it down the line and continuing that trend and following up with another playoff run and maybe going deeper this time and maybe making it to the Super Bowl. I mean, this team was being talked about in that conversation as a Super Bowl contender because of the talent that they have on this team, including Joel. I just don't know that he wants to go out this way. There's no perfect ending in sports. I know we like to think there is. And sometimes there are rare instances where guys get to go out on top, right? Like you think about, I know this may be a touchy example because it's your biggest rival, but the Steelers, like Jerome Bettis had a chance to go out on top as a Super Bowl champion. And he did it in his hometown, nonetheless, in Detroit. So there's instances where sometimes the cards fall correctly for you. The path kind of falls in your favor, and you're able to go out in like this just memorable fashion at the top of the game or after making some memorable play or something like that. Those instances, though, are few and far between. So there's no perfect ending for somebody like Joel. There wasn't a perfect ending for Joe Thomas. It was kind of unceremonious in a lot of ways. So I don't know that he has to like come back to like get this grand finish that ends in a Super Bowl run and goes out in like a blaze of glory. I think I'm not saying that, but I do think like there's a lot of disappointment in how this season went. Nobody saw this team going 3-12, let alone whatever they're going to finish as. I'm kind of predicting already probably 3-14 when it's all said and done because I think they do lose the next 2. But like, so I'm not saying that he's going to go out like, and it's just, they're going to reverse fortunes and he's going to, be hoisting the Lombardi and that's his perfect, ride off into the sunset moment. I'm certainly not trying to imply that, but I do think he wants to, if he's going to end his career, I think he wants it to be on a little bit higher of a note or a little bit better of a season than this dismal 3 and again, 14 that I'm predicting that they probably end up finishing the season with. So that's kind of my read on it. We'll see obviously how these next 2 games go and what the future holds for Joel. He'll talk about it a little bit more. And I also do think like, even though he dodged the question a little bit, I do think like the rebuild versus reload thing probably will mean something to him when it's all said and done. He's not thinking about it right now, like I said, and that's fine. Once those decisions start being made and the organization kind of makes it clear what direction they're heading, and again, I think they're probably going to do the reload rather than rebuild and try to stay competitive. But if they were to pull the plug and say, let's just start all over, obviously that means Myles Garrett might be gone because he implied that he wouldn't want to stick around for that anyway. But I think Joel Bitonio maybe considers the same, like has the same thought process. Like, do I really want to go back out and put my body on the line for one more season just to be part of a rebuild? Or, do we take one last kind of run and see what we can do in the name of trying to be competitive still? And I still feel like I can give it my all for that purpose and that cause. So I do think that could ultimately factor in here too. But I'm going on the record now. I think Joel Bitonio is back for at least one more season. I don't think these next 2 games are his last 2 games in a Browns uniform, which is good news because Joel's an easy guy to root for you, for me, for everybody. All right, that is just about it. Another episode of the Locked On Browns podcast in the books with you, Dog Pound. Thank you for joining me, as always, to talk about your favorite football team, even in this disappointing season that has left a lot of people feeling apathy towards this franchise. There'll be plenty more to talk about in the week ahead. Obviously, Christmas tomorrow, I will not be doing an episode. I'm going to be spending some time with the family, but I want you to spend some time with your family as well. So I'm freeing you up from having to feel like you got to make me your first listen on Wednesday, but we'd appreciate it if you still do. If you want to go back and listen to an old episode, or if you missed an episode, you are more than welcome to do that as well. Continue to make us your first listen, and we appreciate you for being an everyday, or for your second listen. Go on and check out one of the new Locked On NFL shows, or if you want to keep it local, you can check out the Locked On Cavs podcast or the Locked On Guardians podcast. Again, thank you for being an everydayer at the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Have a Merry Christmas, or just happy holidays in general, whatever you might celebrate. I will talk to you again real soon on Thursday as we start getting you ready for Browns and Dolphins this weekend. But for now, I am out.